Did you grew up in Qatar? Were you born in Qatar?
I was born in London and I lived in London for 5 years. And then we moved to Gaza in Palestine.
Gaza?
Yes, Gaza. It was
What
quite
took you to
interesting.
Gaza?
But in reality, liberal democracy is not universal at all. It's rigidly Western. It talks about freedom and equality, but only under its own terms. It decides what it means to be free, what it means to be rational, what it means to be educated, what it means to be civilized. And if a society doesn't fit that mold, it's labeled as backwards, illiberal, in need of saving, in need of liberal democracy.
I thought that Hassan Iqbal did not understand the overall sensibility and the way the whole debate was organized. When he responded to you, it looked as if he thought that you made a personal attack on him.
I would just pick up on one thing. I thought it was slightly hypocritical to make comments about Imran Khan being Taliban Khan.
Mr. Imran Khan, commonly known as Mr. Taliban Khan, is a great fan of Taliban democracy.
How do you look at a country like Pakistan, what's happening over there? What are your views, whatever your views are? I mean, how are you looking at Pakistan?
Connection of corruption and democratic structures. It isn't just, you see it all over the Arab world, unfortunately, all over the Muslim world as well, and you do see it in Pakistan.
What is the meaning of global south in your mind? What is the meaning of liberal democracy? And why do you think liberal democracy has failed the global south?
Who then decides what society is improved? What does improvement look like? If improvement is just, a Western standard, and these colonizing entities are the ones who are deciding what is improved, there's a conflict of interest here because they can hold that metric wherever they want to hold it, continue to exploit the people.
The very same United States, which 25 years ago was talking about spreading democracy in the Middle East, they were the same United States who 20 years prior to that were arming and funding the Mujahideen.
Liberal democracy means you have to bring the element of constitutionalism into it. That means you have to bring in a legal framework and laws that have to protect the minority point of view, the minority expression. So you have to protect the Ahmadi, you have to protect the gay and lesbian, you have to protect the woman, you have to protect the children, you have to protect the Hindu, you have to protect the atheist. This is what the liberal democracy is. But your debate on the Oxford Union and you are actually focusing too much on the economic dimension of the liberal democracy.
When I was talking about how those values were inherently Western, it's that their understanding became inherently Western. Like what it meant to be liberal, what it meant to be free, became only an understanding of freedom under a Western umbrella. So for example, when they see a woman in a hijab, for a very, very, very long time, it was that woman was oppressed. Right? It was that woman is different from the Western understanding of a free, liberated woman. And because it is different, it is inherently illiberal.
Assalamu alaikum, this is Moeed Pirzada with a very different kind of program, with a different kind of discussion. I have two guests with me today who are totally unfamiliar to you. Well, one of them is a bit familiar to you. His name is Asad Iqbal. He is a student in Oxford of politics and management, if I'm not wrong, or economics and management, I think. And you have seen him in the Oxford Union debate because when he commented on Pakistani Minister Hassan Iqbal. But the other guest with me is totally unfamiliar to you. She currently resides in Qatar. She's joining us. Well, Asad is joining us from Oxford right now. He's in Oxford University. Arwa is joining us from, I believe, Doha in Qatar.
Yeah.
And I would like to know a little bit more about Arwa. Arwa, I also found your surname more difficult for me. Like it's Arwa Hanal Rais, right? Am I right?
It is. So it's actually a connected first name. So it's Arwa Haneen, and then my surname is Al-Rayes. So Arwa Haneen Al-Rayes.
It's Arwa Hanil. Arwa Hanil is one name.
Yes, technically, yeah.
And can you tell us what is the meaning of Arwa Hanil?
Okay, so it's not actually like a one meaning for both words. Arwa, I believe, is some form of deer, and Haneen is the feeling of longing.
Okay.
So it's not that it makes sense together. It's just two. My parents actually my dad wanted to call me Arwa, my mom wanted to call me Haneen, and then they compromised to just calling me Arwa Haneen. So that's where the name came from.
I want my viewers to understand you. You're so, mashallah, living in Qatar, you're so well spoken and so articulate, right? Did you grew up in Qatar? Were you born in Qatar?
Now, I was born in London and I lived in London for 5 years. And then we moved to Gaza in Palestine.
Gaza?
Yes, Gaza. It was quite interesting.
Gaza?
Well, very, very, very long story, but my family from my dad's side is originally from Gaza, and we had the rest of our family there. When my grandfather passed away, it was more that the family was going towards Gaza to try and build up from a legacy that he had established. And so that it was a very, very, very long, very complicated story, but I'm glad it happened. because I think that's where I kind of became very politically aware of everything that was going around me. And it was from my experience in Gaza and the fact that I was able to leave when a lot of my family members, a lot of my cousins weren't able to leave. And I now have experiences, I now have opportunities, whether education wise or standards of living wise, that a lot of my family members didn't have. That now I'm kind of pursuing politics. So I'm really glad for the opportunity that I was able to go and live there. But after Gaza, I then moved to Qatar, and I've been living in Qatar for the last decade.
For how long you lived in Gaza?
So we were supposed to only stay for 6 months, but we ended up staying for a couple of years. But it was a real experience. It was definitely worth it, to be honest.
How
Seeing
old?
living,
How? I'm very intrigued. How old were you when you left Gaza?
I think I might have been 7.5. So between the ages of like 5 and 7, I was in Gaza. So I do remember quite a bit of it. And I think that's what
You,
why the topic of
my
liberal
my
democracy.
my my understanding is you're studying PPE, which is politics, philosophy, and economics in Oxford.
Yeah, absolutely. And my desire to study politics came from my experience in Gaza. The fact that again I was able to leave when so many of my cousins weren't able to leave. It felt like I was given an opportunity when a lot of people weren't able to and didn't have those opportunities. And it was like, what can I do to kind of give back? And I was kind of drawn to politics, that perhaps I could do something or make some kind of difference through getting involved in the political sphere.
But what intrigued me on was this that you mentioned earlier as well. Now you have said for the second time that how Gaza gave you a certain political consciousness, and you were very young when you left Gaza, only 7 years of age. But Gaza, living there, gave you a political consciousness that has stayed with you, and ultimately it has brought to Oxford. Or towards a politics and philosophy degree. I mean, that shapes your political consciousness. But after Gaza, you also lived in Qatar, which is, for my prejudice and worldview, is a much more depoliticized place. So living in Qatar for the last 1 decade hasn't depoliticized you.
No, not at all. I think there's a lot of misconceptions about living in the Gulf in general, or living in Qatar. Even living in Gaza. I mean, when I went to the UK and I told people that I had lived in Gaza and I had lived in Qatar, I was immediately met with like a lot of stereotypes that were, frankly untrue. Qatar was probably the political compass was kind of it started to be established in Gaza, and my political awareness, but it was really kind of it was allowed to grow in Qatar. I had so many different opportunities, whether that be in with Al Jazeera or even in my school debating competitions, where you could openly talk about these things. It was not all something that was suppressed. And in fact, it gave me the environment to kind of explore a lot of these thoughts a lot more deeply. And I wouldn't say at all that it had suppressed me. If anything, it gave me a lot more opportunities. I don't think I would have had half the opportunities I had had if I hadn't lived in Qatar for the last decade. I don't think I would have made it to Oxford if I hadn't lived in Qatar for the last decade.
Very, very interesting. I spent a week in Doha, in 2019, and I was much impressed by the society. I thought that Doha was a different city from almost every other Middle Eastern city I had visited. But Asad is sitting there lonely and sad listening to all of this. So let's actually go towards Asad a bit. Asad, what brought you to Oxford, and what is that political consciousness that actually made you so controversial when you are believed to be or supposed to be attacking Hassan Iqbal in the Oxford Union? What happened there?
Well, I'll just start off by saying thank you, Dr. Pirzada, for having me participate in this discussion. And it's a great honor for me to be here on your show because I've been following it for the last few years in relation to affairs in Pakistan. And I think I view you as one of the few journalists in Pakistan who have both an uncorrupted moral conscience, but also a very high level of a very high intellectual bar, which makes your conversations and your programs very interesting. So
You're
a bit
very
about
kind,
myself.
very generous. You're very kind and very generous.
No, thank you. I'm speaking based from the heart, but I think about myself. So I'm Asad, and I'm an undergraduate student at Oxford. I'm reading economics and management. I've always grown up in the UK, and being here in the UK, I've had a tremendous level of respect for the strength of British institutions, and in the sense that with the rule of law, with everyone being equal before the law, with the fact that state power is limited, and I contrast that to Pakistan, and which is my country of heritage, and it's always kind of saddened me that the law in Pakistan is, it was famously described as just being the constitution is just a piece of paper with writing on it. And it's just a way of the powerful, weaponizing it to coerce the weak. And so I always had that in the back of my mind, that why is there such a disparity between the country in which I'm growing up and the country which is, my country of heritage. And the example, there's so many examples. There's the example of former Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. He was not spared for even a simple seatbelt law violation, which is unthinkable in Pakistan. I mean, the situation of lawlessness there is just appalling. And I've always I've cultivated my interest and my passion in politics, and I think coming to Oxford has been an amazing experience for that. Like Arwa, I've been on the Oxford Union Committee for the past 2 terms, and I think it's been an amazing environment to have difficult, contentious conversations about topics like Kashmir, like Taiwan, like Palestine. And I think the way in which Oxford cultivates these conversations in a free speech environment is something which you don't see in any other university, be that in European campuses, nor even in American campuses, despite them proudly declaring themselves as, the flag bearers of free speech. So I'm proud of that, and I think it's been a good environment for me to be able to gather my interest. And I think my interest in Pakistani politics is really that on a principled level. I think I look at the situation, and ultimately, both my religion teaches me that when you see something wrong in society, you should speak up about it. And I think the Oxford Union debate was one example where I was able to do that. But I've constantly sought to have these conversations with my peers at Oxford about the situation in Pakistan. And it's always pleasing to see that, there's like-minded individuals having these conversations. And I think the political awareness in my generation, not just about Pakistan, but about the issues of the Muslim world, is growing. And that's something for me which is very pleasing.
So, Asad, very interesting listening to you. So, just a few words about Ahsan Iqbal. I thought that Ahsan Iqbal did not understand the overall sensibility and the way the whole debate was organized. So when he responded to you, it looked as if he thought that you made a personal attack on him, right? But when I watched all debates, I thought that this was part of the ritual, the way the whole debate was conducted. What do you think of it?
Well, I think I've been attending Oxford Union debates every single week, actually, this term, and I've attended many of them last year as well. And it is a tradition within the debate to introduce the speakers on the opposite side of the House, and to do so, with a touch of British sarcasm. So I
Right.
don't think there's anything unprecedented or anything unexpected in my introduction. I would say that I realize that in Pakistan it took off quite a bit, but I think it's quite a natural part of these sorts of debates. In relation to how Ahsan Iqbal responded, I mean, he absolutely has a right to, use his 10 minutes as he chooses, but I would just pick up on one thing. I thought it was slightly hypocritical to make comments about Imran Khan being Taliban Khan, whereas in his own country, they label him as a as a Zionist agent. So I think that hypocrisy was on display. But I think what people need to realize is when they come to the Oxford Union, the audience is not going to be stupid. They have a very strong political acumen and political awareness, and I think they understand exactly how things operate in in these developing countries, and
Hmm.
the duality of these politicians.
Very well, very well. So coming back to you, and first of all, I mean, both of you have spoken. I have introduced you. Now, feel free to interrupt each other. I mean, when I used to do my television programs with two or three people, I used to tell them that once a person has spoken, you should feel free to interject, to interrupt, I mean, and you don't really have to wait for me to ask you a question. For instance, if Asad is speaking, you can jump in. If Arwa is speaking, Asad, feel free to basically jump in and say that you want to add something, or you want to accept or reject that thing. Arwa, I mean, before we move to the subject of liberal democracy, which I want to understand my idea of this discussion is that I looked at two brilliant young Muslim minds, young Muslim students from totally different parts of the world. I mean, now we know that you were born, Arwa, in UK, you grew up in Gaza, then you spent your time in Qatar, but and now you're back in Oxford. And Asad, his parents, and Asad, you were probably born in Pakistan and then came to UK, right?
No, I grew up in the UK.
You grew up in the UK.
Yes,
So,
yes.
but Muslim students, young and different. So, I want to see how you look at the concepts of democracy, liberal democracy, West versus the Muslim world, and why the Muslim world is not a democracy. But before we move to that relatively complex thing, Arwa, you come from a very painful political consciousness being a Palestinian. But how do you look at a country like Pakistan, what's happening over there? What are your views, whatever your views are? I mean, how are you looking at Pakistan?
Now, to be honest, I'm not as educated on Pakistan as I would have liked to be. But I think the connection of corruption and democratic structures, it isn't just, you see it all over the Arab world, unfortunately, all over the Muslim world as well, and you do see it in Pakistan. It is unfortunately, now each country is very different as to why that corruption comes about. But to be honest, I don't know too much about Pakistani politics to give you a completely in-depth answer. Sorry, I really don't. I don't know too much.
So basically, you only are aware to the extent that Pakistani politics is connected with corruption. So let's come to the concept of the liberal democracy. You don't have to take the positions you which necessarily took in the Oxford debate, because that was for and against. I want you to understand what you think of it. So, Arwa, you took a position that the liberal democracy has failed the global South. What is the meaning of global South in your mind? What is the meaning of liberal democracy? And why do you think liberal democracy has failed the global South?
Now, so when you actually look at global South and what it tends to mean, it's not so much a political structure as much as it is like described as an economic kind of developmental state, right? So when you look at Singapore, or you look even like Qatar or all the rest of it, they wouldn't be considered part of the global South as much as, other countries who were lesser economically developed. So when people say global South, it's usually referring to a state of like economic development rather than kind of political development. Now, when it comes to liberal democracy and its connection to the global South, there's two ways you can really look at this. There's the historical connection of liberal democracy and what it came to be, how it emerged and its connection to the global South. And then there's the more modern outlook, which is more of like one of, the hypocrisy of liberal democracy. I'll very briefly go through just the historical element, because I do think it is very relevant to how societies look and the world looks today. So, if you look at liberal democracy, very, 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 in its essence, it's a system that, in theory, it's supposed to champion individual rights, civil liberties, a limited government, all within, a democratic framework. So you might ask, how are these universal values, how could they ever lead to situations of colonialism or imperialism or, oppressive social structures? And that's because even if you look at the very inception of liberal democracies, key liberal thinkers, whether that's Rousseau or, Locke or Mill, those who contributed to liberal democracy as an ideology, their ideas were the very ideas that were then used to justify things like colonialism, to justify things like imperialism. And, how was this done? It's because these, universal values, they're not very universal. They're seen in a Western lens. So just as an example, Mill, who was one of the key thinkers of liberalism, he said that, societies could embrace liberal values, except those societies that are seen as, backwards, or societies that are in their knowledge. And in these societies, he was okay with the idea of a despotic government or some kind of authoritarian government taking control and to improve that society until that society could then embrace liberal values. But of course, you can see how corruption can emerge from this in exploitation, because who then decides what society is improved? What does improvement look like? If improvement is just, a Western standard, and these colonizing entities are the ones who are deciding what is improved, there's a conflict of interest here, because they can hold that metric wherever they want to hold it, continue to exploit the people. And so liberalism as a historical ideology was used to justify things like colonialism. Even Arthur Balfour, when he was thinking about the intervention in Egypt, he paints the Egyptian people as people who are incapable of self-governance. So whereas in the West...
Sorry, who wanted to intervene in Egypt?
Arthur Balfour. The author of the Balfour Declaration as well. So to justify the intervention in Egypt, he said, Western nations, as soon as they emerge in history, they show the beginnings of, the capacity for self-government. Whereas if you look at the whole history of the Orientals, they never showed a capacity for self-government. So it's this idea that, the values that they espouse, they are inherently Western. And if you don't subscribe to these Western values, then you are backwards, you are uncivilized, you don't have a propensity for self-government. And therefore, Western values need to be you need to be molded into these Western values, and you need to be, occupied. We need to have intervention, and it's justified. It's seen as they are doing you some kind of favor. And what ends up happening is you end up seeing the world in an incorrect way. You end up looking at the global South at different races, at different ethnicities as inherently backwards. And I experienced this myself because I lived in Gaza and I lived in Qatar.
Asad, come into it. Asad, do you also feel that the liberal democratic values are essentially Western? They're alien to the Eastern societies, to Muslim societies.
Sure. So I wanted to start off by addressing a little bit of what Arwa said about that, and then also addressing what your question about whether they are inherently Western or not. So there is an argument that liberal democracy has been weaponized, as a tool of oppression, justifying invasions in Afghanistan and trying to forcibly impose Western values upon them. And I would certainly agree that whilst the West has kind of used their ideology in this manner, we shouldn't blame the tools, but we should blame those who wield them. And there's two kind of reasons I have for that. So the first reason is the very same United States, which 20, 25 years ago was talking about spreading democracy in the Middle East. They were the same United States who 20 years prior to that were arming and funding the Mujahideen, who are of a completely different political background and ideology. And back then, President Reagan would at length speak about the shared values between the Mujahideen and the conservative American people. So I think, we shouldn't necessarily blame liberal democracy in that sense, because it's just, being manipulated.
What is the meaning of liberal democracy? Look, listening to the debate in the Oxford Union and what Arwa says right now, it appears to me that Arwa is thinking that liberal democracy is about the economics of a society. And your speech also created the impression. What is liberal democracy to you?
Yeah, so I think defining liberal democracy and like having that discussion is also important, because in the Muslim world, when we have these discussions, we have different definitions and we can never really reach a point of agreement. I think one way you can try and define it is more structurally. So you can define it as, the presence of elections, which leads to majority rule and parliaments, et cetera, and the idea being that civil supremacy is prioritized. But my disagreement with that would be that you need to consider the values as well of democracy. And the values that I want to focus on are rule of law. I think the values are space for political dissent, a free press. All of these are values which are important to the discussion for two reasons. Firstly, because without them, you cannot have a democracy. And secondly, I think when we're talking about the Muslim world, these values are very much shared within our culture, within our history. And I think that's the point I was really wanting to get at, which is, in the Muslim world and in the global South, liberal democracy is viewed as a foreign concept that's trying to be imposed onto us.
I'm very interested in it. Hold on to it. You see, for instance, there are a number of things which I have a disagreement with. You said liberal democracy was used to attack Afghanistan. No, Afghanistan was attacked because they thought that they were under attack from Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda was sitting over there. And subsequently, in order to sustain the occupation, they said we have to democratize Afghanistan, we have to modernize Afghanistan, and we have to protect the minorities, we have to protect the women. And then you see when the Americans have left, what is happening to the women in Afghanistan. So there is in fact a truth to it. I mean, after all, 50% population of Afghanistan are young girls and women, right? And a woman are not being allowed to work, girls cannot go to school. I mean, the women doctors are not being allowed to work. It's a horrible situation in Afghanistan. Yeah. So there are two different dimensions, When in 19th century, the British actually went on with the gunboat diplomacy against China, it was purely economic interest. They were not interested in liberal democracy. And another thing which you say is about elections, but that is democracy, the majoritarian rule. Liberal democracy means you have to bring the element of constitutionalism into it. That means you have to bring in a legal framework and laws that have to protect the minority point of view, the minority expression. So you have to protect the Ahmadi, you have to protect the gay and lesbian, you have to protect the woman, you have to protect the children, you have to protect the Hindu, you have to protect the atheist. This is what the liberal democracy is. But your debate on the Oxford Union and what you are actually focusing too much on the economic dimension of the liberal democracy. Why it is so?
No, to just interject a little bit, because I feel like maybe it was misinterpreted. I don't think it is purely an economic aspect at all. I think, and I don't think that these values, the inherent values of equality, autonomy, equal rights, I don't think these are all alien to the people in the global South, because that would be to say that, we don't believe in equal rights, or we don't believe in autonomy and independence. That's false. That is categorically false. When I was talking about how those values were inherently Western, it's that their understanding became inherently Western. Like what it meant to be liberal, what it meant to be free, became only an understanding of freedom under a Western umbrella. So, for example, when they see a woman in a hijab, for a very, very, very long time, it was that woman was oppressed, right? It was that woman is different from the Western understanding of a free, liberated woman. And because it is different, it is inherently illiberal. It is that's what I meant by, it's a Western conception of liberalism, a Western conception of freedom, autonomy, and all the rest of it. And when it comes to Afghanistan, now, of course, I'm not as educated on this as I would like to be either, but when it comes to Afghanistan, it was, from my understanding, the Afghani people saw the intervention of the Americans as not actually targeting the root cause of the issues. It was more that same, we see something different in society, in Afghani society, and we don't understand that these are just their ways of life, some values that they hold very dear to them, whether that be, some of their religious convictions. We lump all of these things, the good, the bad, all of these values, even the ones that are, very justifiably, they are held very dear to the Afghani people. We will lump them all as backwards, barbaric, illiberal, and they all need to be eliminated. And when the Afghani people started to see that kind of intervention on their daily lives and their daily values and their religious convictions, even the ones they hold very that are not oppressive, when they started seeing that interjection in their heads, now they're just thinking, okay, the Americans, this is more of a kind of imposition on our way of life rather than a liberation of us as people. There is a very clear picture of what they want our society to look like, and it's a very Western idea, and that means the eradication of a lot of the values that we hold very dear to ourselves. So it wasn't just that,
I have not been able to convince myself, I have not been able to find a convincing explanation as to what were the real objectives of American power to be staying in Afghanistan for 20 long years.
The rationale behind the invasion of Afghanistan, and I just wanted to clarify that, when I mentioned that democracy had been used as an excuse to invade Afghanistan, what I really meant is that, that is an argument that is made.
But democracy was not the excuse. Osama bin Laden and 9/11 was the excuse.
We should not allow the West or America to monopolize those values, those democratic or those liberal democracy values. When we're talking about rule of law, whether we're talking about rights, take the example of Hazrat Ali. He had his sword stolen from a common citizen who happened to be a Jew. And when he went to court, the judge knew that the sword clearly belonged to Hazrat Ali, who was Khalifa at the time. But since Hazrat Ali could not produce a witness other than his brother, what ended up happening is the judge ruled in favor of the common citizen.
Why young people, Muslim like you, have developed this concept that these values of liberal democracy belong to the West?
So even if you were to look at the idea of private property, for example, in the days of the Native Americans, there was this idea that, property had to be used or land had to be used productively. That's a great thing. Nobody doesn't want to use land productively. I'm not saying that is inherently a Western conception, right? But the West then used that idea of productive land use. They looked at the Native Americans and they said, that use of land is not productive. Only our use of land is productive.
Out of the 49 or 48 Muslim countries, not a single one is a democracy. Forget about liberal democracy. Why it is so?
I think what's really important is that we focus on those shared values, those rule of law, the space for political discussion and dissent. And I think another thing that's important is that if you do decide to have certain rules, certain laws, which are different to those in the West based on your own cultural values, that it should still follow the rule of law, that you shouldn't be legislating in a way that the rich and powerful get to trample over that, and the poor and the weak, unfortunately, are basically a victim of that particular law. It should be on an equal basis.
Why the Muslims are not arguing that radio, television, handheld mobile devices, F-16, guns, all of the technology things, this is all un-Islamic because it's all Western, why they're very ready to use everything rather than the democracy principles. So, Arwa, what are you going to do after Oxford? I was in Pakistan during all this, and I was actually in Columbia when the 9/11 happened, and Columbia University, New York, and 9/11 happened. I saw what happened in New York, and then I was in Pakistan. I was in UK when 7/7 happened. Then I was in Pakistan. So the invasion of Afghanistan and the occupation of Afghanistan, and I have read almost every book written by the American scholars, military officers on the Afghanistan thing, by ex-CIA officials. To this point and this day, it is not. And I have also discussed with the State Department people, CIA people, and all that. To this day, I have not been able to convince myself, I have not been able to find a convincing explanation as to what were the real objectives of American power to be staying in Afghanistan for 20 long years. Yes, they had to go after Al Qaeda, they had to destroy Osama bin Laden, but why were they actually staying there? Was it to keep a watch on Pakistan's nuclear weapons? It was to keep a watch on China, to have a presence in the region, a strategic foothold. And that is why perhaps the Pakistani military, as it is accused, basically saw the American presence as a threat to them. And then they were playing double games. They didn't want Americans to stay there forever and so on. So the Afghanistan becomes very complex. But let me put a different perspective to you. I look at a young Muslim woman of Palestinian descent, empowered, bold, confident, articulate, able to carry herself. I'm sure there will be hundreds, if not thousands, of similarly capable potential Afghan girls as well, right, throughout Afghanistan, out of its 30 million plus population. They are not being allowed to develop themselves just like Arwa has developed herself. And this, to me, is a tyranny. What do you say about it?
No, it's a tragedy. I mean, nobody is saying that Taliban regaining control of Afghanistan is a positive thing at all. I mean, it is absolutely a tragedy. But I do not think the way that the Americans approach, I don't think anybody who actually looks into the situation will come out of it with the opinion that the ways that the Americans approached it was a way that was favorable to the Afghani people. I mean, if the very removal of the United States after 20 long years, you were saying yourself, what were they doing there for 20 long years? If the very removal of the American intervention led to the crumbling of literally everything that they had established, then clearly what they were doing, or the institutions that they were trying to build up, clearly it didn't work. So, we can kind of
So what
go
options
into
they had? What options they had? They built institutions, they brought jirga, they brought elections, they took the woman to school, college, university, but they couldn't sustain it. So what options they had? What should they have done to help the woman?
to be honest, I'm not a policymaker. I haven't, researched in depth the various international interventions that could have been undertaken by the Americans. It is just the fact that if something was going to emerge out of 20 long years of American intervention, right? It shouldn't have been the complete reversal of everything that they had tried to achieve. Clearly, something went wrong along the way. Now, what went wrong? Honestly, I would not want to lie to you. I do not have enough information to be able to very confidently say. I don't think anybody knows exactly what went wrong, but clearly something did go wrong. Now, what they could have done in return, I don't know. I honestly, I would not be able to tell you.
I have some faint idea what went wrong, but Asad, what do you think? What happened?
Yeah.
What's your comment? I mean, whatever your comment is.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things I wanted to touch on. So firstly, I know you mentioned about the rationale behind the invasion of Afghanistan, and I just wanted to clarify that when I mentioned that democracy had been used as an excuse to invade Afghanistan, what I really meant is that that is an argument that is made
But
in that.
democracy was not the excuse. Osama bin Laden and 9/11 was the excuse.
No, I mean, there are commentators on some side who maybe not justifying the entry into Afghanistan, but the fact that they spent so much time there,
20
one of
years.
the justifications that is given is that one of, maybe not the primary objective, but one of their objectives was, increasing democracy in the Middle East. And that is what I was basically trying to point out the hypocrisy of, because I think for anyone, who's intellectually honest, I think it's clear that that is never, they've never been in good faith trying to spread democracy. I mean, just back in the 80s, they were funding the Mujahideen, who obviously were completely opposed to democracy. So I think that should not be then used as an excuse to then say, okay, well, liberal democracy was attempted in countries like Afghanistan and Libya, and it failed. And so therefore that means that, liberal democracy has failed the global South. I think that is the argument that I'm trying to make. I think if we are to encourage or to call for democratization in Afghanistan, you mentioned some of the concerns. It should be, internal. It should be adapted according to local customs and values and our religion. And I think trying to impose it from a foreign perspective is, it's never going to work. It only ever leads to destruction. And I think the second thing I wanted to mention is that we should not allow the West or America to monopolize those values, those democratic or those liberal democracy values, when we're talking about rule of law, whether we're talking about rights. And I wanted to share some examples really from Islam and Islamic history, which show that actually we have just as much claim to those values as the West do. In fact, we arguably have a greater claim to those values. I mean, I can share with you an example of which shows just how important rule of law, minority rights and the separation of the executive and the judiciary is in Islam. I mean, take the example of Hazrat Ali. He had his sword stolen from a common citizen who happened to be a Jew. And when he went to court, the judge knew that the sword clearly belonged to Hazrat Ali, who was Khalifa at the time. But since Hazrat Ali could not produce a witness other than his brother, what ended up happening is the judge ruled in favor of the common citizen. Now, it was easy for Hazrat Ali to use his force as the head of such a large empire to compel that citizen to give him his sword back, but he decided to accept it graciously out of respect for the rule of law and out of respect for minorities. So I really resent this attitude that actually, these values that they're trying to impose, and I see this unfortunately as a consequence of American invasions, that they've almost antagonized the people in Afghanistan and in Pakistan into thinking that actually any of these values that are espoused from the West must be antithetical to our values. No, we should go out and assert that, whether it comes to economic liberties, the concept of property rights, the concept of not having,
So can we
excessive
actually
state
understand this thing that
regime.
whenever the West, United States or the West, have
Yeah,
invaded any part of the South, the global South or the Muslim world,
yeah,
they have never ever done it for democracy. They have always
exactly.
done it for economic reasons, for strategic
Yes.
reasons. What happened in Iraq, what has happened in Libya, everywhere they had geostrategic reasons. And
Yeah,
then they have put on the liberal democracy color onto it in order to
exactly.
take the liberal Democrats along with them. I mean, let me put some, a thesis in front of you. I'm very glad that Assad brought the reference towards Islam, that these liberal democratic values are not necessarily antagonistic and alien to Islam. For the past several days, I'm actually reading a book, which I'm going to show on the screen as well. This is a book by an American professor, Michael Cook, and that is a book that's not about theology. It is just basically political analytical history, a history of the Muslim world. It's a big book, about 1,000 pages, and you should actually, since you are PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics, you should actually try your hand on that book, Professor Michael Cook. I'm going to put it on the screen. So I was reading, he says that Islam was a black swan event. The rest of the Muslim history is just a normal white swan event, but emergence of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula was a black swan event that no one expected a powerful state formation to take place in Arabian Peninsula, which had absolutely no precedence in history because these were tribal people with their own tribal law. But then he goes on, as there are hundreds of pages on it, he goes on to explain that Muslims and Caliphate and Islam for the first time introduced the concept of the rule of law. Now, one gets surprised that why it is rule of law by the Muslims in that area, because the Persians and the Byzantine had rule of law in the hands of the powerful people, just like in Pakistan, Assad said a short while ago. So in the Byzantine Empire, which was around the Arabian Peninsula, and the Persian Empire, the law was basically a tool in the hand of the powerful. Islam, for the first time, brought law as a tool in the hand of the common people, and they brought people equal. So the Islamic Caliphate, starting from 632 after death, after the demise of the Prophet of Islam, was a far more liberal, democratic, egalitarian, and equal society that anything had existed in that part of the Middle East or anywhere in the world at that time. So why have we now started thinking this thing? Of course, we haven't progressed from that point onwards, but why young people, Muslim like you, have developed this concept that these values of liberal democracy belong to the West?
It's not so much at all that these values inherently belong to the West. Again, I do not think that the West is the one that monopolizes values like equality and rule of law at all. Like, that is fundamentally not what I'm saying. It's more that the way that the values of liberal democracy have been used historically, even since the inception of liberal thought, were very much seen underneath a Western lens. So they were used to further Western agenda. So even if you were to look at the idea of private property, for example, in the days of the Native Americans, there was this idea that, property had to be used, or land had to be used productively. That's a great thing. Nobody doesn't want to use land productively. I'm not saying that is inherently a Western conception, right? But the West then used that idea of productive land use. They looked at the Native Americans and they said, that use of land is not productive. Only our use of land is productive. And they used that as justification to take away the land from the Native Americans and colonize and the Americas. And it is that process that I'm talking about. You can apply the same logic to things like, for example, equality. I'm not saying that people in the Arab or Muslim world or people in the global South do not hold the values of equality as important to them or as fundamental. And in fact, Islam was one of the main proponents of equality. It's just that when these values of equality or when any of the other liberal values are used by the West, they are used in a very specific way that is underneath the umbrella of what the West understands to be equality, what the West understands to be liberalism. That is what I am criticizing, not so much the inherent values themselves. Nobody would ever say that. I do not believe at all that Islam is inherently opposed to liberal values. I think, as you said, we were one of the main proponents of liberal values. So yeah, as I was saying, it was just a connection.
If Islam is not inherently opposed to the liberal values, as we can see that the first caliphate, the Khilafat-e-Rashida, between 631 to 661, was one of the most democratic, egalitarian, equal, rule of law based society in an area where none of that existed even before. So why the whole Muslim world is now convinced that Islam and democracy are not compatible with each other? Out of the 49 or 48 Muslim countries, not a single one is a democracy. Forget about liberal democracy. Why it is so?
I don't think it's because the people don't believe that Islam is compatible with democracy. I think it is because the way that, unfortunately, the result of centuries of colonial practices have meant that the institutions that we have are just not there enough to support the blossoming of democracy. You can look at the consequences of the Arab Spring, for example. Is that not a surefire signal that the people wanted a democratic process? It was unfortunately stifled, and that is the issue. I don't think at all the people in the global South or the people in the Arab world think that democracy and cannot be compatible with their way of life at all. I think that there have just been fundamental obstacles that many of them are the remnants of colonialism, and many of them are the remnants of even foreign intervention. I mean, a lot of the democratic processes that should have emerged after the Arab Spring didn't emerge because of foreign intervention. I don't think it's the people that are opposed to democracy or the youth or any of that.
Asad.
Yeah, I think there's three reasons I can think of why you have a situation. I mean, I can speak for Pakistan. I think in a lot of segments of Pakistani society, the concept of liberal democracy and its values are seen entirely antithetical to Islam. I think the first reason I would describe is, as I mentioned, with all these foreign interventions, with colonialism, and with the rhetoric that you get from the West that, we are here and we are going to bestow our liberal democratic values upon these people. I think what that does is antagonizes the people in those countries into thinking that actually these are foreign values and these are, we should repel them, when it actually isn't the case. And so I almost think it's a little bit sinister when you see this sort of rhetoric, because it's almost trying to discourage any democratization in these countries by antagonizing them. I think the second thing I want to point to, and I sort of alluded to this in my debate, but I didn't really get the time to expand on it, is economic interests. I think, ultimately at the end of the day, whenever you have a democratization in a country, whenever you have a decentralization of power and resources, the concept of resource allocations no longer becomes a decision of a singular head of state. And I think, especially in countries like Pakistan, where you have these entrenched economic interests, you have mafias in various different sectors, for them, any democratization would lead to, potentially that country going through a massive period of economic development and finding its competitive edge and leading to, economic upheaval that actually benefits the country but might damage their own interests. So they're always going to be opposed to it. And unfortunately, if it means creating political rhetoric that shows that democracy is a foreign concept to protect their own interests, then that is unfortunately what ends up happening. And I think the final thing is that in the Islamic world, the kind of conversations that we have is that, back in the Abbasid era, we had this concept of ijtihad. We were intellectually curious. We would seek ideas.
So have you followed the debate between the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ari?
So again, I'm not too well read on that specifically.
The rationalist and the literalist between 9th and 10th centuries. The rationalist, the Mu'tazila, believed that, you can have a rational interpretation of Quran and Sunnah as per the changing times, and Islam is a philosophy and a way of life and a way of governance for all times to come. Whereas the Ash'ariya, actually, which were the literalists, believe that you have to do a literal translation. You can't really interpret the word of Quran. You have to follow the literal meaning of the word.
Well, I think the spirit of discussion, of debate, there's a whole chapter in the Quran about it, and about titled Surah Shura. And actually, you know, there's an example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who, no one else can compete with him in terms of having received divine revelation. So if he is consulting his companions about, there was a specific decision that had to be made as to whether to meet an invading force outside of Medina or within Medina, and he actually had his mind changed by his companions. So if he is having his mind changed, then why is it that we have that we view everything in such a monolithic frame where there is a literal translation? That there has to be discussion about all of these things, and I think that narrow frame of thinking, that conservative frame of thinking, is why we now in the world have become so inward looking. And I think there's nothing wrong with retaining your own red lines, your own values in your culture, and looking at your shared values. For example, if we share the concept of rule of law with the UK, then there's nothing wrong with looking at the UK and saying, how have they built a strong justice system based on that principle, and learning from it and implementing it, which I think is one of the things that Imran Khan has tried to follow, that sort of principle.
So,
Yeah.
Arwa, uh, uh, I have this feeling that both of you, especially you, look toward the West as a monolith. So when you say West, you look at all of UK, all of West is just one thing. And you're not looking at the difference that there are liberal Democrats in the West. They actually believe in liberal democracy, and there are people who want to use the weapon of the liberal democracy, and they who also do not believe. For instance, the followers of the Trump camp do not necessarily believe in the liberal democracy in the same way and the rest of the Americans believe. So when you say West, you're making West into a monolith.
No, I agree with you there. It is important always to make those kind of nuanced distinctions. But when I am referring to liberal democracies as a whole, it is more or less a kind of like legacy, and it's what they refer to themselves as well. It's when you search up, or the United States also does refer to itself as a liberal democracy, or the United Kingdom refers to itself as a liberal democracy. It's more a title. It's optically relevant more than it is a definition. It's more of like a picture they present to the rest of the world. And I think that's why a lot of the Arab world, a lot of the global South and the Muslim world become disillusioned with the idea of liberal democracy. It's not because they are against. If you were to sit them down and explain what liberal democracy is actually supposed to stand for, nobody would be against principles of freedom and equality, right? It is more what it has begun to represent, and I think that is the issue. It is what liberal democracy now kind of appears to.
But there is a problem. But there is a problem, Arwa. You just heard Assad. He says there are elite camps who do not want democracy because democracy will bring rule of law, it will bring equality, it will bring transparency, and they have a very solid control on the economic resources. If there is more transparency about the economic distribution, then Pakistan is 250 million people, and there are probably a few hundred or a few thousand people that control the resources of Pakistan. If there is genuine democracy in Pakistan, the rest of the younger people would also like to have a share. There is transparency, there is rule of law, so the ruling elite will be challenged. So the ruling elite then actually brings all kind of concepts. It makes an alliance with the Muslim ulama and the scholars to basically say that look, democracy is not Islamic in character. Also, they have another problem. You see, now you have ultra conservative men in Muslim societies who actually think that women are not equal to them. They want to have more wives than the time. They also want to look down upon the wife. They think that the woman's place is in the kitchen. She should get married, have babies and children. So all these kind of ideas then clash against the liberal democracy.
Yeah, but those ideas are, if we're saying that these ideas stem from Islam, they are inherently un-Islamic. The idea that there isn't equality between.
I'm saying that. I'm saying I think the elite interpretation in their own favor.
No, of course, I would not disagree that there is intervention, especially from the elite. I think this is a characteristic of all different areas where democracy was attempted to be established and ultimately was not established, or there's been shortcomings in the democratic process, has been because of the intervention of corrupt elites. That is I don't think I at all would disagree with that position. No, I agree with that 100%.
Asad.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think this is another difficult dimension to the discussion, because obviously I think throughout this discussion we've talked about the shared values between Islam and democracy. But inevitably, there will be some values that might not be the same as quote unquote Western values, and I think we have to approach it in the sense that, okay, let's not try and apply a secularized or Western form of democracy in our country and as a whole, because what ends up happening is you alienate those large groups of people who do have those views. But I think what's really important is that we focus on those shared values, those rule of law, the space for political discussion and dissent. And I think another thing that's important is that if you do decide to have certain rules, certain laws, which are different to those in the West based on your own cultural values, that it should still follow the rule of law, that you shouldn't be legislating in a way that, the rich and powerful get to trample over that, and the poor and the weak, unfortunately, are basically a victim of that particular law. It should be on an equal basis.
So let me throw a difficult question to both of you. You're Oxford students. Why the Muslims are not arguing that radio, television, handheld mobile devices, F-16 guns, all of the technology things, this is all un-Islamic because it's all Western. Why they're very ready to use everything rather than the democracy principles. Arwa. No, Afghans are not saying this thing that we're not going to use the American weapons. The Afghan Taliban are not saying that we're not going to use the Russian weapons or the American weapons or the night vision goggles, but the idea is.
I don't think that's a fair question. I think when it comes to, again, it's not that people are inherently against. Like if you were to sit people down and deconstruct what liberal democratic values are, you'd be very hard pressed to find anyone who is against those values. It is simply what those liberal democracy as a package, what it has come to mean to the global South. It has come to mean a system of hypocrisy, has come to mean a system of, values for some and rights for some, but not for others. I don't think it is that, we see the values of liberal democracy as inherently Western. I've said this before. I think that they can be applied to all sorts of people. I think it's just a package, again, of liberal democracy has it's lost. A lot of people have become disillusioned with the idea of liberal democracy because they see how it's actually played out. The support, as Asad was saying earlier, the support of liberal democracies in the West of certain groups and not others, even though those certain groups might have values that are completely contradictory with liberal democratic values. You can just look at the Israel-Palestine situation. If you were to completely bypass Gaza and just look at the West Bank, billions have been funneled into the Israeli government. They have been setting up illegal outposts in Palestinian land since decades now, and this has become public knowledge in the 2005 Sasson report. So the West knows this, and yet they continue to fund billions of dollars into supporting a government that is quite antithetical to Western liberal democratic ideals when in their treatment of the Palestinian people. So it becomes a sort of well, democracy will only be championed by the West when it suits their interests, and liberal and human rights will be upheld only when it suits the West's interests. And it's that disillusionment. It's not disillusionment with the ideals of liberal democracy. It's the disillusionment with what liberal democracy has then began to represent to the global South, to the Arab world, to the Muslim world.
Okay, winding up, this is a very interesting debate, but again, actually. So, Arwa, what are you going to do after Oxford?
Honestly, I probably look for some kind of opportunity in British government, British policy making. The goal would be to make it to
so you're not going back to the Muslim world.
I think there's a lot more bridging that can be done between the Muslim world and the Western world. I think there is not enough voices like people who have experienced Gaza firsthand, for example,
right,
but still have the connections to London and to the UK, and who can say the experience firsthand. Because a lot of my experiences of the UK have been like that. I have been talking to people about Palestine, and they'll tell me, "Well, you don't know because you were never there. Why do you speak about these things as if you know what's happened there?" And that's when you can look at them in the eye and say, "No, actually, I've lived that. I've experienced that. I've seen the double standards. I've seen the hypocrisy firsthand." And I think that having that perspective, being able to voice that perspective, knowing that you've experienced it firsthand in a place in the UK where you've got the proper institutions established, I think that can make a much bigger difference than, being submerged back into the world that I currently am in. I think there's a lot more work to do to bridge these two worlds together. And I hope that a voice like mine can be part of that bridging process.
I'm sure. I wish you all the best in this future. Asad, what about you?
Well, I would say that, undoubtedly politics is an interest of mine, and I think as it should be for everyone in our generation. And I reject this mindset with some people who they proudly declare themselves as apolitical or politically neutral. I think that in itself is a political choice. But, That being said, for the Muslims generally, it's important that we kind of enter a diverse range of fields because for any society or community to develop, you basically need, all of the organs to function. And so, as a student of economics and management, I'm interested in finance and business, and in particular in investment banking. And I'm hoping that can give me a strong skill set, and I can also pursue my passion of business and facilitating these large transactions during that time. And but what I will say definitely is that we do need a mindset shift as Muslims, which is firstly that we need to be pursuing excellence constantly, and I think we do. But in certain areas, I think I've been incredibly pleased to see the Muslim community in Oxford very ambitious and always pursuing excellence. But the second dimension we need to add is that we need to constantly be thinking about our society and attaching a purpose to what we do, whichever field we're in, outside of the self.
Yeah,
And
actually, I wanna just
yeah.
yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No,
Go
finish.
ahead.
I just wanted to. This is touched on something I feel very passionate about. I'm not sure how it is in Pakistan or in that area of the world, but especially in my in the Arab world and where I've been raised, subjects like the humanities, like politics, like philosophy, like these humanity subjects are very much looked down upon. In my father's days, when you went through
100%.
yeah,
So
and that's
why do you think so? Why the Muslims are more interested in studying IT, medicine, engineering, technology, and not the philosophical subjects? Like why?
I think I honestly I could not tell you. I grapple with this myself. I think it's probably a reflection of what careers were seen as higher paying, what careers were seen as more prestigious. To be a doctor was more prestigious than to be someone who sits down and thinks all the time. But the issue with that is that we end up putting so in my father's days you would graduate from secondary high from sixth form from secondary school with a grade, and that grade would then tell you what to study in further education. The higher the grades you took, the more likely you were to study law and not law, sorry, be a doctor, engineer, all the rest of it. Those who got really low grades, those were the ones who then went and studied religious studies, politics, economics. So what you end up having is the very foundations of society, which are built on things like economics, like politics, and in the Muslim world, religious, religious fundamentals. These get taken up by people who, they're not the brightest of the bunch. There's a fundamental mismatch of talents when it comes to the humanities, and I really hope that through seeing more people from a Muslim background engaging in things like politics, engaging in things like economics, things like philosophy, all the rest of it, that can start to change the mentality there. Because I really think that's what's lacking in the Muslim
If I
world
could
today.
just make one more comment on that, actually.
Yes.
When I was reading a book
Let me add an additional question to that because of your background from Pakistan. What do you think is the reason that the Indian diaspora and the Indian origin academics have created the name in social sciences and sciences? You take any book. When I go to Barnes and Noble, I find every week a new book by an Indian author. It is not necessarily about India. It's actually about biological sciences, about medicine, about geography, about American history, about the global history. Why we don't find any books from Pakistani origin or Muslim origin authors?
Exactly, and I was actually just about to allude to that I was reading a book about the decline of the Muslim world, really beginning when the debate, as you mentioned, between the conservatives and the rationalists, the conservatives ended up triumphing. And really what happened is the brightest minds, as Ara mentioned, in the Muslim world, systematically over the last few hundred years, have been going into other endeavors. If it's in the Islamic world, they'll go into Sufism. If it's in other endeavors, they might go into medicine or in IT, for example, as you mentioned. And I think what that comes down to is fundamentally there's a lack of we don't encourage intellectualism and we don't encourage debate from the household all the way up to the national level. And I think once we start to do that, it'll affect everything from the micro level changes to the macro level changes. Not only just will we start to see Muslims going into a more diverse range of fields, but we'll start seeing the impact on the national level. We might start seeing more democratization in for example, Pakistan.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Asad and Arwa. It's a pleasure listening to both of you. And I hope it was a very constructive discussion, but I look forward to having more of that discussion in the coming weeks or coming months. Thank you so much once again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.